The rain that night wasn't just water falling from the sky. It was every tear I'd swallowed, every word I'd choked back, every moment I'd pretended their cruelty was love. And when I finally walked out of that house with blood in my mouth and my son's torn shoes in my hands, I knew something had died in me that would never come back. What I didn't know was that something far stronger was about to be born. Thunder crashed as I stumbled through my parents' front door, soaked and shivering. In my hands was a paper bag containing cheap sneakers for Liam, my 7-year-old son. His old ones had holes that exposed his toes to the other kids' mockery. "You worthless brat. Late again, and where's my money?" Barbara's voice cut through the air like a blade, her face twisted with familiar disgust. Richard didn't look up from his newspaper, his contempt radiating from behind the pages. His silence was worse than screaming because it meant I wasn't worth his attention. "Liam needs these shoes," I said, voice shaking as I held up the bag. "The other kids are making fun of the holes in his old ones." Barbara snatched the bag and ripped it open, examining the sneakers with disgust. "You bought this garbage while Chloe needs money for her honeymoon in Hawaii?" She hurled the shoes against the wall. One bounced near my feet, the other fell behind the couch. Richard finally lowered his newspaper, and when his cold gray eyes met mine, I saw nothing but hatred there. Pure, undiluted hatred for his own daughter. "Your bastard son is worthless, just like you," he said, his voice low and deadly calm. "You've always been the shame of this family, Maya. Always." He stood up then, his bulky frame casting a shadow over me, and I knew what was coming. I'd seen that look too many times before. His thick fingers wrapped around my upper arm like a vice, and he dragged me toward the dining room table. I didn't resist. I'd learned long ago that fighting back only made it worse. Barbara watched with satisfaction as Richard positioned me next to the heavy wooden table. Without warning, her palm connected with my cheek in a slap so hard that my ears rang and my vision blurred. The taste of copper filled my mouth as I bit down on my tongue. "Still think you can lecture us about priorities?" Barbara hissed, her face inches from mine. "Still think that little mistake of yours deserves anything from us?" Richard was already unbuckling his leather belt, the same thick brown one he'd used on me countless times throughout my childhood and now, apparently, my adulthood. But this time was different. This time there was no rage in his movements, no heated anger. His actions were cold, calculated, methodical. This wasn't punishment born of emotion. This was torture born of cruelty. The first strike across my back knocked the wind out of me. The second made my knees buckle. By the third, I gripped the table edge, knuckles white, refusing to cry out. I bit my lip until I tasted blood, letting pain fuel the fire building in my chest. Each lash tore not just my skin but my soul. Yet through the agony, strange clarity emerged. This wasn't discipline or tough love. This was cruelty, pure and simple. When Richard finally stopped, his breathing was heavy from the exertion. Barbara tossed a bag of frozen peas at me, hitting my shoulder. "Don't forget Chloe's wedding is next week," she said casually, as if she hadn't just watched her husband beat their daughter bloody. "Make sure you hide that ugly face of yours. Don't ruin the family photos." I gathered the shoes with shaking hands, one from near my feet and the other from behind the couch where I had to crawl to retrieve it. Neither of them said another word as I limped toward the door, my back screaming with every movement. The walk back to my apartment felt like miles, even though it was only 6 blocks. Every step sent waves of pain through my body, but the physical agony was nothing compared to the emotional devastation. When I finally reached my front door, I could hear the television through the thin walls. Inside, Liam was curled up on our threadbare couch, having fallen asleep, waiting for me to come home. I knelt beside him and gently shook his shoulder. His eyes opened, bright and trusting despite everything we'd been through. When he saw the shoes in my hands, his face lit up with the kind of pure joy that only children can feel over such simple things. "Are these for me, Mommy?" he whispered, careful not to wake our neighbors through the paper-thin walls. "Yes, baby," I managed to say through the tightness in my throat. "Try them on." As he slipped his small feet into the sneakers, I noticed how his toes had room to breathe for the first time in months. He wiggled them experimentally, then looked up at me with such gratitude that I nearly broke down right there. "Thank you, Mommy. I love them so much." He threw his skinny arms around my neck, and I held him close, breathing in the scent of his shampoo and the innocence that still clung to him despite our circumstances. After I tucked him into bed, I sat alone in my tiny kitchen and made a promise to myself. Never again. I didn't know how, I didn't know when, but somehow, some way, I was going to get us out of this cycle of abuse and humiliation. The next morning, while Liam was at school, I walked into the offices of a cleaning company downtown. The manager, a tired-looking woman named Ruth, explained that they needed someone for the night shift, cleaning office buildings when everyone else had gone home. The pay wasn't much, but it was honest work, and more importantly, it was work my family didn't need to know about. "When can you start?" Ruth asked, looking over my application. "Tonight," I answered without hesitation. For the next 2 weeks, I worked 70 to 80 hours between my day job at the diner and my new night job cleaning offices. My feet swelled and bled in my cheap shoes. My back ached constantly from the beating and the physical labor, but every dollar I earned felt like a small victory. Each paycheck was another step toward freedom, another brick in the wall I was building between us and them. 2 weeks later, my phone buzzed with a text from Barbara. "Chloe's bachelorette party tonight. You better show up or don't bother coming to the wedding." I stared at the message for a long time, then deleted it without responding. But at 7 o'clock that evening, I found myself standing outside the upscale restaurant where Chloe had decided to celebrate. I wore my only decent dress, a black one I'd bought at a thrift store years ago, and I'd covered my fading bruises with makeup. Inside, the party was already in full swing. Chloe sat at the head of a long table, surrounded by her friends and wearing a white sash that read "Bride-to-be" in glittering letters. She was opening presents, each one more expensive than anything I'd ever owned. I was seated at the far end of the table, as far from the guest of honor as possible. The other women glanced at me occasionally, their whispers carrying just loudly enough for me to catch fragments. "That's the sister, the one with the kid. I heard she's never been married." Chloe held up a silk scarf from Tiffany & Company, exclaiming over its beauty while her friends oohed and ahed appropriately. When she noticed me sitting quietly at the end of the table, her smile turned sharp. "Maya," she called out loudly enough for everyone to hear, "you can probably leave now. This part is really just for people who actually contributed something to my wedding." The laughter that followed felt like acid on my skin. I looked toward Barbara, hoping for some small defense, some acknowledgement that I was still her daughter too. Instead, she shrugged as if to say that Chloe was right. I stood up slowly, placed my napkin on the table, and walked out without saying a word. Behind me, the laughter and chatter resumed as if I'd never been there at all. That night, after Liam was asleep, I pulled out a shoebox of old photographs. There was Liam's first Christmas, sitting alone under our tiny tree with a single coloring book I'd bought with tip money. In another photo from the same day, Chloe's pampered poodle wore a designer sweater, surrounded by more gifts than my son had received in his lifetime. I began writing everything down. Every incident of favoritism, every cruel word, every moment they'd made clear that Liam and I were worthless to them. 3 days later, I called the resort in Hawaii where Chloe was planning her honeymoon. Pretending to be her assistant, I asked about their reservation details. What I discovered made my blood run cold. The $12,000 deposit for the presidential suite had been paid with a check bearing my forged signature. They had somehow gained access to an old joint bank account from when I'd briefly lived with them after Liam was born, an account I'd forgotten existed. I hung up the phone with shaking hands and immediately drove to the bank. The teller, a kind woman named Mrs. Chen, pulled up the account information and confirmed what I already knew. Not only had they forged my signature, but they'd been making small withdrawals for months, always careful to keep the amounts low enough that I wouldn't notice. "You'll need to file a police report," Mrs. Chen said gently. "This is fraud, honey. They can't just use your name like that." Instead of going to the police, I drove to a coffee shop across town and called Ben Carter, a boy I'd known in high school who had grown up to become an investigative journalist. His podcast, Small Town Secrets, had gained a following for exposing corruption and abuse in communities like ours. "Maya?" Ben's voice was warm with surprise when he answered. "God, it's been years. How are you?" "I need your help," I said simply, "and I think I have a story you'll want to hear." We met that afternoon in a quiet corner booth of the coffee shop. I laid everything out for him, the notebook full of incidents, the bank statements showing the fraudulent withdrawals, photos documenting years of favoritism and neglect. Ben listened without interrupting, his expression growing more serious with each detail. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and let out a low whistle. "Maya, this isn't just a story, this is a case study in psychological abuse and financial fraud." "Can you use it?" I asked. "Are you absolutely sure you want me to? Once this goes public, there's no taking it back. Your family will know it came from you." I thought about Liam, sleeping peacefully in his new shoes. I thought about the bruises on my back that were finally starting to fade. I thought about the years of being told I was worthless, that my son was a mistake, that we deserved nothing. "I'm sure," I said. Ben's podcast episode aired 1 week later, titled The Price of Favoritism, When Parents Choose One Child Over Another. He never mentioned names directly, but he didn't need to. Anyone in our small town would recognize the details. The successful businessman father, the socialite mother, the golden child daughter with her expensive wedding, and the scapegoat daughter, raising a son alone. The response was immediate and devastating. Within hours, the episode had been shared hundreds of times on social media. Comments poured in from people sharing their own stories of family favoritism, but also from locals who recognized the Evans family. By the next day, whispers had started at the country club, where Richard played golf. Barbara found herself uninvited from her usual charity committee meetings. People who had once fawned over Chloe's engagement began to see her differently. But the real blow came when Chloe lost her sponsorship deals. She'd built a modest social media following around her wedding planning and lifestyle content, but the companies that had been paying her to promote their products began to distance themselves from the controversy. Her carefully curated image of the perfect bride from the perfect family was crumbling. 3 days before the wedding, I received a wedding invitation in the mail, addressed specifically to Liam. Inside was a handwritten note from Barbara. "The boy can come, but you stay home. Your presence will be awkward for the real family." I read the note twice, then handed it to Liam. He looked at it with confusion, his 7-year-old mind struggling to understand why he was invited but his mother wasn't. "Mommy?" he asked, his voice small and uncertain. "Am I not real family?" I knelt down and pulled him into my arms. "You are my whole world," I told him. "You are the only family that matters." That night, after Liam fell asleep, I made a decision that would change everything. For the past 6 weeks, while working my 2 jobs and barely sleeping, I had been saving every penny I could. It wasn't much, but it was enough to put a down payment on a small house in a town 2 states away, near a good elementary school where Liam could start fresh. I had already contacted a school district there and arranged for Liam's records to be transferred. I'd found a job at a local diner that paid slightly better than my current one, and the cost of living was lower. Most importantly, it was a place where nobody knew the name Evans, where nobody would look at my son and whisper about his parentage. On Chloe's wedding day, while she was walking down the aisle in her $10,000 dress, I was packing our few belongings into my old Honda. I didn't leave a forwarding address. I didn't call to say goodbye. I simply disappeared. But before I left town, I made 3 stops to deliver 3 packages. To Chloe, I sent her torn wedding invitation in a plain envelope with a note written in permanent marker. "You don't get to call me family when it's convenient. I'm not your accessory." To Barbara, I mailed a framed photo of me holding newborn Liam in the hospital, both of us exhausted but radiant. Across the glass in permanent marker, I wrote, "This is the moment I became enough. You just never noticed." To Richard, I left his old work boots at the front door, the ones I'd worn while cleaning office bathrooms at 2 a.m. to make ends meet while they stole from me. Inside one boot was a note. "These boots helped me walk away from you. Your fists never could." I changed our phone numbers and deleted every social media account. The silence that followed wasn't emptiness. It was power. Our new town was small but welcoming. Liam's teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, stayed after school to help him with reading when she noticed he was behind. Our elderly neighbor, Miss Rose, taught him to plant tomatoes in her garden. A single father named David, who lived in the house next to ours, brought homemade soup when Liam caught the flu. These people didn't care that I wasn't married, didn't care that I'd made mistakes, didn't care whether I came from money or prestige. They cared because caring was what decent people did. 3 months after we moved, I received a letter forwarded through my old boss. Barbara's handwriting, no return address. "You're cruel," it said. "We've lost everything. We've lost you. You got what you wanted. Are you proud?" I read it once, then threw it away. Their opinion no longer mattered. In our new life, Liam flourished. He made friends, his grades improved, and most importantly, he laughed. He lost his first tooth playing basketball, coming home bloody grinned and proud. "Did it hurt?" I asked. "Nah," he grinned. "It's just part of growing up, right, Mom?" I understood the difference he'd identified. This was growth pain, not the pain of being hurt by someone supposed to protect you. 6 months after we left, I learned through Ben's follow-up reporting that Richard and Barbara were struggling to maintain their lifestyle. The scandal had cost Richard several business relationships, and Barbara had been quietly removed from her social circles. Chloe's marriage had lasted 4 months before her husband filed for divorce, citing her inability to handle criticism and her expectation that the world owed her special treatment. But their downfall wasn't what gave me satisfaction. What mattered was that Liam wore shoes that fit, went to bed in a warm house, and woke up knowing he was loved unconditionally. What mattered was that I had learned the difference between being alone and being free. I had left behind people who made me feel worthless and found people who saw my worth without me having to prove it. I had stopped waiting for love from people incapable of giving it and started accepting love from people eager to share it. The scars on my back faded, but the scars on my heart transformed into something else entirely. They became proof that I had survived, evidence of my strength, and most importantly, a reminder of what I would never allow in my life again. On Liam's 8th birthday, as I watched him blow out his candles surrounded by his new friends, I realized that the life I'd built wasn't just better than the one I'd left behind. It was better than anything I'd ever dared to dream possible. I had thought escape meant running away. Instead, I learned that freedom meant running towards something better. And every morning when I put on my shoes and Liam put on his, both of us dressed for whatever challenges the day might bring, I knew we were exactly where we belonged. The woman who had once begged for scraps of affection from people who despised her was gone. In her place stood someone who understood that love isn't something you earn through suffering. It's something you recognize when you finally believe you deserve it. And we did deserve it, both of us. Finally and completely, we deserved it all.